All right, hello everybody.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to Sequoia Park Zoo, and thanks for coming to the lecture series tonight. I'm Ruth Mock. I'm our zoo's Director of Conservation and Research, and I chair our Sequoia Park Zoo Advisory Group's Conservation Council. And so that oversees our conservation programs, including our lecture series that you are attending tonight. So we're just very glad to have everybody here. The Conservation Council helps support our zoo's conservation vision by recommending different conservation organizations to support through our conservation fund and to help raise awareness about conservation issues that we think are relevant to our community. So the lecture series is helping us meet part of that goal by inviting everybody here tonight for this free talk. So thank you for coming, and thanks to our council members, including Chris, who I saw back there, for all their hard work on the Conservation Council. And this lecture is free, so there's no obligation to donate, but we do have a donation basket in the back next to our snacks. So if you feel like you can donate, that helps support our conservation programs, and we do really appreciate that. So for our folks that are here in person, if you need to leave early for any reason, you can go out that back door and then come around and go out the gate that you came in. And if you need to use the restroom, you can go out that back door and it'll be just to the right. And finally, if we could all silence our phones, that would be excellent. So thank you so much. I want to welcome our Zoom participants who are here tonight. Thanks for coming. We will have a Q&A at the end, so if you want to put your questions in the chat. And I noticed that there's a new Zoom feature where sometimes it's not obvious how to submit a question. Since you can't send a chat to everyone, you'll have to click on Sequoia Park Zoo as the host. So you'll start a new chat, then you'll see Sequoia Park Zoo where you can start that chat and submit your question. So hopefully that makes sense. That's not on all the different versions, but we did notice that last time. And then hi to everyone at Access Humboldt. So we've got lots of coverage here tonight, and we're excited to be able to reach so many people on this very important topic. So those of us who are here in person know, but our zoo is situated on a beautiful urban redwood forest, Sequoia Park. It is the tallest urban forest in the world. We are very lucky to have that here and to be immersed in the redwoods. And it's a very important part of our zoo's messaging. And as a redwood forest enthusiast, we're very excited to welcome tonight's speaker, who is here tonight, Lathrop Leonard. Thank you for coming. He's the lead forester for the California State Parks North Coast Redwood District, which includes all the state parks in Redwoods Rising, as well as Humboldt, Del Norte, and northern Mendocino counties. Lathrop runs the forestry and fire management programs for the district, where he's worked since 2004. And outside of this project, he has worked in habitat conservation and restoration in other areas like Western Washington, Colorado, and Kenya. So, lucky person. He's joining us tonight to discuss Redwoods Rising and their wonderful collaboration to help build healthier redwood forests in our state parks. So thank you for coming tonight. Come on up.
And I just wanted to start by saying I've been to a couple of these lectures before, but this is the first time I got early enough to see the slideshow at the beginning, which is super cool because you can see all these great other conservation projects that the zoo's been involved with. So if you didn't get here early, try that next time and help get you up to speed on some neat things going on. So again, my name is Lathrop Leonard. I've been working in the field of restoration ecology for a while, and specifically forestry and prescribed fire has kind of been my focus. And so taking you a little bit through Redwoods Rising, which sometimes is a little bit confusing to folks. You can see this is Redwood National Park, State of the Redwoods League, and California State Parks are the big major partners in this organization. But these organizations have been partnering and working together for, in some cases, 100 years. So what Redwoods Rising is a relatively new thing. So let me walk you through a little bit about why that is. Oh, I've got to point it that way, don't I? Uh-oh. fine, I'll go. There we go. Okay. So just to give you a brief history, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of redwoods and humans and how they've interacted, and how that interaction over the centuries and decades has led up to the formation of Redwoods Rising. And to jump a little bit ahead, Redwood Rising is about restoration. And there's three major components with it, some smaller ones as well, but we'll talk about forest restoration, road removal and rehabilitation, as well as aquatic habitat. And then I'm going to end the talk with talking a little bit about where Redwoods Rising is going and how I think we see the future of this organization. So it all starts, really the deep history is with the Tolowa and Yurok nations, who were both call what is now Redwoods Rising Redwoods Rising is within their historic homeland. And this is lands that they had managed since time immemorial, easily for thousands of years, right? And I think historically, a lot of the colonizing peoples thought of these tribes as just basic hunters and gatherers and not really just kind of living off the land. But what we've learned, as many of you may know, over the more recent decades, is that actually they were managing this land in many ways that we're still coming to terms with. But they had developed systems much more complex than hunter-gathering implies. And they were managing these lands in a sustainable way that had sustained their families for many generations, and they were well set up to manage them for many generations to come. And of course, that all changed. And it's rare, I think, in this kind of circumstance to be able to come up with such a definitive date. But for the area within Redwoods Rising, I'm really putting it at 1853. And that seems pretty specific, but it's really was a seminal year in this area for a number of reasons. First of all, Crescent City was formed up in Delmarva County. Not only was the town formed, but the first mill was opened to process logs. And the first logs were cut in Mill Creek being one of the watersheds within Redwood National and state parks, as well as within Redwood. And finally, this was, wait a minute. This was the year of the Yontucket Massacre, which was one of the largest massacres in the history of the United States. And while the Yurok and the Tolowa peoples are still within these counties and are thriving in many ways, they also, at this time period, around 1853, they really lost their ability to manage the lands the way that they had been managing them for thousands of years. Okay, so this is the beginning of the change of a new era. Like I said, there was a tiny bit of logging, but really this period after 1853 was mostly marked by a lack of management. We went from managing by the tribes to nobody managing this land until around the 1920s. And that's when the logging really began. This is a picture for those of you who have been to Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. You probably came in on Howland Hill. So picture was taken from kind of the corner of Howland Hill Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, looking north up Howland Hill. And the Hobbswall Timber Company built a railroad line along that road to get logs from the forest adjacent to the park to the mills in Crescent City. And this was their idea of sustainability, was you build, oops, sorry. Whoa, I gotta be careful with this thing. Okay, they had a logging community here. They built these bunk houses. They built a school. This is where their folks stayed to do the work. And when they logged a piece of land around their little village here, or their camp, they loaded up all these buildings onto the train and moved it down the railroad track to the next tract of land. And they could use the profits from one logging operation to buy the land to do the next piece. Okay, so a definition of sustainability. Don't know if everybody would agree that that's sustainable in today's age, but that's where we were. And it took, and this is kind of what the land looks like after that. This is, of course, a picture taken from, I think, the late 60s, but former old growth forest, logged and left, in many cases left to come back on its own. In other cases, aerial seeded and other things. But that's what was left behind. But there was a group of folks that saw that this was not sustainable, and they really wanted to have old growth redwood forests there for future generations to enjoy. They didn't want to cut it all down. So they formed this group, say the Redwoods League. And in those early decades, they were pretty successful in protecting a lot of land. And about 50 years after their formation, they were finally able to achieve one of their great goals, and that was to establish a Redwood National Park in 1968. So, but one interesting thing is that you look at my timeline here, a mere 10 years after the formation of the park almost doubled in size. And what's especially peculiar about that is that the initial park was the most expensive national park ever created anywhere. So you can imagine the controversy and the challenge that Congress and others went through to think about. They just put an amazing amount of money into building this park. They had to double it in size. So why did they have to do that? Well, let me show you a picture of some of the logging that was going on in areas adjacent to the park. So this is what we call a plank road. If you look really careful where these people are sitting, you see all the logs that are placed next to each other, right? They're just right, all back to back, right next to each other. Where are these logs placed? It's over a creek. You see that? And if you look at how flat this land is, I don't know exactly where this picture was taken, but I'm sure that there was fish in that creek. You think there's any more fish in that creek? Not a chance, right? I mean, even if, yeah, there's no creek, right? You can haul logs down this and you can not get stuck in the muck, but it's no longer really a creek. So, okay, but again, this is happening outside of the park. A problem for some, but not necessarily for the park, maybe. Well, then we had the 1956 and 64 floods. And these were both really devastating floods that would have been pretty horrific under any circumstances, but they were made much worse due to the way people were logging the land all over the place. And so what we saw in those floods was that the landslides and the torrents and the debris flows that came from the logged areas and went downstream into the parks, and in some cases destroyed pieces of old growth. So you can see on the bridge here and across the road, there's logs from where the land was washed away. And now it's not only damaging the roads, but again, our parks were damaged by those floods because of what was happening adjacent to the parks and especially upstream of the parks. So give you a little history of the evolution of forest conservation here. Started out, like I say, we're buying land to protect it from logging. Then we've got and protecting that old growth. Then we discovered that in order to protect the old growth, we also have to protect the second growth, first by purchasing it. And then finally, we get into restoring some of that second growth, because in current times, we're down to about 5% of the original old growth redwood forest remains. The rest has all been logged. And many would say that 5% isn't enough, especially when you consider that there's endangered species that are in danger of going extinct because they're lacking old growth habitat. Okay. And as we talk about restoring its second growth, I just want to throw out there this concept of the age of the trees that we associate with old growth is probably, as a forest ecologist, the age of a tree or a forest is less important than the structure of that forest or of that tree. Okay, so as an example of this, you see in the foreground here, we've got a second growth forest in the background and an old growth forest. So thinking about structure, does anything come to your mind about what's lacking in the foreground that the background has?
No diversity, they're all clones.
There's a lack of diversity, yeah.
No gap spaces.
Yeah,
so
spaces.
far.
Right, so the structure is very different. Okay, I got a good crowd here. This is
Yeah.
kind of a monoculture.
Really, they make good Christmas trees, but you wouldn't want to build a nest in one.
Right,
No epiphytes.
no epiphytes, right. And at a very fundamental level, there's no 1,000-year-old trees in the foreground. There's no 2,000-year-old trees, which there probably is in the background. But more importantly than the age of the tree is there's no big trees. They're all real small, right? Okay, so these young forests, after your clear cut or your stand replacing fire or whatever it is, you've got all these young trees. And this is especially true, high density of young trees. They're all really healthy and fine when they're young, but as they grow, they expand, they get bigger, and they don't have enough space to grow. They start competing heavily with their neighbors, right? And they're putting all their energy into getting tall, and there's no energy left for them to get big in diameter. So they get tall and skinny and unstable and vulnerable to falling over in a windstorm or an ice storm or something, right? So what do we want to do? We want to grow big trees. I want old trees, but to get a 1,000-year-old tree takes 1,000 years. To get a really big 10-foot diameter tree or a 20-foot diameter tree like we see in old growth redwood forest, there's no specific amount of time. It depends on growing space and other things, right? So if we thin this forest on the left out, like this guy's doing, and make it look like the forest on the right, the trees that are remaining have the space to grow and to thrive, right? We're getting to old growth faster than we would if we did nothing. Here's a looking up at a slightly older forest. Again, crowded canopy, hard for any of these trees to grow very well. You thin it out, and then there's space. Okay. An industrial forest owner would be doing something thinner. They want their trees to grow rapidly too, but they tend to grow them on an even spacing. So every tree gets about the same amount of growing space. There's no wasted growing space. The trees grow well for a while, and then the canopy closes again. Growth is slowed. All the understory vegetation goes away because it's not getting enough light. And we're kind of back to a similar situation where this forest has the lowest biodiversity that it ever will, right? But for the timber company, that's just setting them up for the final harvest, right?
Yeah.
Of course, with state parks, we're not looking for a final harvest. We're looking to grow a forest in perpetuity, more or less, right? So we do what's called variable density thinning, as you all mentioned, where we're varying the spacing between trees. In some places, we're putting in small gaps where as the trees grow and the crowns expand, we're still going to get light to the forest floor. In other areas, the trees are still relatively dense and competing with each other. So trees are growing at different spaces or at different paces. So we're getting that diversity of tree sizes that we like to see. This, by the way, is part of a controlled experiment where the trees on the left were unthinned and the two other areas were thinned to different densities. We're experimenting with different restoration treatments and tracking changes over the long term to see what the most effective way of restoring these forests are. So we can improve on the science we already know about how to get this done. And we're monitoring that long term. Okay, come on. Okay, so I want you to take a close look at this picture. Not only to see how many people you can find. Sorry if you're on Zoom on a small screen and that's hard to see. But part of the reason I want to show you this is that this is a really old tree, right? But again, what's more interesting to me than how old the tree is and how big it is, but it's the structure. Again, you remember our young trees, conifers in general have one stem, one trunk with these lateral branches. It's a very simple structure. The tree on the right is very complex. And all those little complexities are making little nooks and crannies that are basically habitat of various sorts. So the trees on the left are kind of useless for northern spotted owl or for marbled murrelet. But the tree on the right has all sorts of little habitat features. And eventually these things grow into some amazing structures. So much so that any plant that you find on the ground in a redwood forest, you can also find 100, 200 feet off the ground. Okay, and they're not only these plants, but there's all kind of like salamanders and other organisms that are living in fern mats like this that never touch the ground. They live their whole lives up in the forest canopy. We'll get to questions. Do you have something quick?
Curious if those were called sky islands?
Sky islands? I don't know that particular term, but yeah, sounds good. Yeah. Anyway, so this is that kind of diversity. By the way, there's 5 people in that photo. That's probably even harder for the folks in the audience to see, but it gives you an idea of how big this tree is. 200 or more feet off the ground. Again, this is probably a 1,000-year-old tree, but I'm more interested in structure than age. All right. So when we're thinning a forest, we're looking for some of those trees that are not just a boring straight one that the industrial timber owner would want to protect to maximize timber production. We want some banged up trees that are kind of a little busted, because those are already starting to develop some of those complexities that we like to see. And in fact, we may even thin around these trees to make sure they have plenty of growing space to become those old growth trees even more quickly. Here's just a quick picture of a before and after to show, like I was saying, about how light getting to the forest floor after thinning allows the understory vegetation to respond pretty quickly. And we're getting new types of habitat there that's going to allow more critters to use that forest than would be using it prior to thinning. But Redwoods Rising is not just about forest restoration. It's about the whole package, everything that's going on with this land. And one of the other examples of that is we are full of old logging roads. And in this case, this old culvert rusted through. So the water, instead of flowing through the culvert, is going through the dirt. The dirt gets all wet and muddy, and then it gives away. So you've got this big problem here, right? And sometimes that problem is much worse. And the road becomes unusable. And where does the dirt go? The dirt goes to the creek, right? And so what are you doing? You're degrading water quality because of a lack of decent roads. Here's kind of a graphic of how it looks like to build a road. So this little red triangle that I drew here kind of shows you the slope of this land prior to building the road. And then what people did is they probably took a bulldozer or something and dug out that red triangle and pushed it over the edge of the hill.
That's a lot of side cuts.
Right? And so there you go. So I think you can see that the obvious first problem there is that dirt is now on a really steep pitch, and it's kind of vulnerable to sliding, right? The other thing, if you notice, is underneath that red triangle is a layer of organic matter. And so the dirt above and below are kind of prevented from binding to each other because of this layer of organic matter. And as the organic matter decomposes, it kind of acts like grease, and the whole piece above wants to slip. And so there you have it, right at that change from where the organic matter is, this whole piece of land is now heading to the stream where it's going to kill salmon. So again, Redwood National and State Parks, we've been doing this type of work with the help of Save the Redwoods League for several decades. But we got to a point where we realized this type of restoration work is really bigger than any of us. To do it at a really grand scale and do it properly has some big challenges. For example, I'm going after grants for forest restoration. Somebody else in my office is going after grants for road removal. If we get money for road removal or road rehabilitation, that's great. But if we need to remove a road and I don't have money to do restoration, then they're going to remove that road and then I can't get back there without a great expense because the road is gone, right? So you've got to do these together. But the person who gave the money for logging, in some cases, they're like, sorry, this money is earmarked to help salmon, for example. Well, you know, forest restoration is great, but my grant is mandated to do this other work. So how do you merge these all up? So Redwoods Rising is making a commitment to not just piecemeal restoration, but to do the whole thing, everything that's needed on a piece of land while we have access, and to find the most efficient way to get this work done. Another example is, well, you know, we had challenges with contracting where our contracting office was short-staffed. So there's going to be a delay in getting the contract to hire contractors to get this work done. Well, maybe one of our partner agencies doesn't have a staffing shortage and they can put the contract together for us. So we're looking at who is most capable of helping out and filling in the gaps, and how can we work together to do this more efficiently. Sometimes it's more efficient to pay a contractor to do work. Other times it should be a government employee. You know, it's all different. Every situation is different. We've got to figure out that puzzle and work together to figure out how to put these pieces together. So it's really, again, we're doing integrated restoration at a landscape scale. Again, here is a picture of Redwood National and State Parks. The dark green areas are showing the old growth and the light green areas are showing the second growth. Okay, so where are we working? What should we do? What is Redwoods Rising? First of all, these two dark, the upper arrow is showing the old growth within Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. And that bottom arrow is showing Lost Man Creek within Redwood National Park. Those are two of the largest tracts of old growth forests left on the planet. Bummer that there's all this second growth right in between them, right? So Redwoods Rising has taken on the greater Prairie Creek area as one of its primary restoration sites. So that second growth between those two pieces, we're restoring it to connect these two pieces of old growth back together to make them more function as one larger forest. Similarly, up north, we have Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park and Delmar Coast Redwood State Park with this big light green second growth in between the two. This one's a little bit more complicated. Well, in various ways, like Prairie Creek, all of that was logged kind of at about the same time, and it's a hot mess. It hadn't been managed for many decades. Up north, they were logging up until the year 2000 on some of this land. And so some of the land is recovering in the short term quite fine on its own, and other pieces of that property are a hot mess. So the prioritization of where to go next is a little bit more complicated. And it's also more complicated because remember, we're talking about holistic restoration. We've got the Humboldt martin, the picture at the bottom here, living on the eastern side of that the greater Mill Creek property up north. So we want to find a way to improve habitat for the martin and help it find its way over into the better habitat of the old growth. Since the formation of Redwood Rising, just so you know, we now have Humboldt martins living in the greater Prairie Creek portion as well. But when we formed this group, we did not know that. Again, holistic, we're also looking at invasive species management. If we're going to open up a road for restoration, we got to think about what exotic plants are in that area, try to deal with them. Okay, so let's get down and see what this really looks like on the ground. I put this red line over this tree to show this, that tree is going to be in the next several pictures, okay? So this looks like a reasonably healthy forest, right? But if you were to walk around in there and look around, what you would discover is that it's actually a bunch of old logging roads under all those trees and stuff. So, and you can see they're standing on dirt, really over a creek, right? So the first thing we've got to do, if the clicker work, is get the dirt out of the creek. And then recontour the land so that the creek can flow naturally and we don't have more perched material ready to fall in the creek and again degrade aquatic habitat. Here's another time series showing a road being removed and how quickly the vegetation recovers after the restoration. Now, in this case, we didn't do any planting in there. This is all natural regeneration coming back in the forest because these lands are so productive. That's not to say we never do any planting. We do plant minor species or underrepresented species in some places to get them back as a component into the forest. Here's another, looks like an okay young, very young forest, but it's actually dirt growing over a creek. So we pull all this dirt out of the creek and there it's flowing again. It's not just about getting the dirt out of the creek. In a lot of cases, we've actually got to put wood into the creek to re-establish the complexity that the creek had prior to all the manipulation by the timber industry. So here's another series of taken from about the same spot. Here's what this little piece of creek looked after before any restoration. You can imagine when the water comes up in the high flows in the winter, any little baby salmon in there, they got nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. They're getting flushed toward the ocean, right? So what we do is we put a bunch of logs in the creek. And then when the water comes up, there's more debris and logs upstream that are just floating down the river that get racked up against our structure here, making a bigger structure. And that structure is slowing the water down so that those little fish, if they get tired, they can find some slow water and rest and not get flushed to the ocean. It's also allowing the water to inundate the floodplain. So there's this, what was once dry land is now the fish can go occupy. And what's in that land but a bunch of bugs. So there's all this extra food that is available to the fish that would not be available to them if this floodplain weren't reoccupied by the water. Here you can see some of the logs that we put in the creek this summer. And this fall, as the rains came, if my video works, they came right back. They're spawning in the gravels out in the open, and you see they went and they probably saw me and went and hid under the logs where they can avoid predators, right? We also have endangered coho salmon. This was taken in the Mill Creek, Greater Mill Creek project area, although we certainly have coho down in the Prairie Creek portion as well. Now, when you look at this restoration, sometimes if you go out on a field trip with us, you might say, well, that looks a lot like logging. And guess what? That's because it is a lot like logging. In fact, it is logging, but I talked a little bit about the differences between the way we thin a forest and we log as compared to if you're just have profits on the mine, right? So we're using some of these people that were worried about losing their jobs because the parks are locking up our forests. Well, we're putting them to work because they've got the exact skill set needed to do the restoration. And they love it. They're so happy to be doing something different. It's a little more complicated, but it's a fun challenge, and they're ready to dig in and really want to make this more of their career in many cases. We're also hiring, we have partnered with Cal Poly Humboldt. So we're hiring students as apprentices to help us get this work done and to train a new generation to help with restoration. Okay, finally, as promised, what's next? So this is a little ambitious on a large scale, but very feasible on a small scale is my vision here, which Redwoods Rising is completely bought into, is that we're using the chainsaw as one of our major restoration tools today. And what I'm hoping is that over time, we're putting away the chainsaw and picking up the drip torch, because the Native Americans, this was their biggest tool for managing these forests historically, right? So if we can shift these unnatural forests into a state where they can grow and develop into a way that they can sustain fire, then let's introduce fire on our terms. In this case, I'm burning all this fuel that's in the understory so that when a wildfire comes, and we all know the wildfire's coming, right? Like this kind of area, it's inevitable that a fire's coming, and it's probably going to come on one of the hottest, driest, windiest days of the year. So let's reduce the fuel loads now under our terms, so when that wildfire comes, we can put it out. Or we can let it burn as a natural process. Maybe put it out before it escapes onto private land and threatens people's homes. There's all other types of habitat within Redwood National and State Parks and within Redwoods Rising. You can see this picture from 1948. The area between the two red lines is not forest, right? You can probably see that. And if you stared enough of these photos, you can tell what that is. It's shrubs, brush with some trees poking up through it. I also know that within that area between these two red lines, there was a Kalawa village in 1853 and before, of course. So this picture again is in 1948. So imagine 100 years of no management is what you're seeing here. So that brush, 100 years before this photo was taken, was a grassland. And the Talo were burning that grassland and letting the fire creep into the tan oak forest adjacent to it and managing for acorns among other food items. Okay. Now, fast forward to around the time State Park purchased it, and you can see all that former grassland has grown into a forest. And in many cases, it grew into enough of a forest that they clear cut it and replanted it. So now we're at a decision within Redwoods Rising to decide, what are we managing pieces of land like this for? I mean, so part of it's Redwoods Rising again, but we're managing for all the ecosystems that were there historically before all these changes occurred since 1853. So we've got to figure out where we can reclaim areas as grasslands, not only make it a grassland, but maintain it, because we have to burn it every few years in order to keep all those trees and the shrubs from coming back. So where is that feasible to do? That's part of the next puzzle that we're in the process of figuring out. So again, with fire, in some cases, we're gonna have a low intensity fire creeping through the understory. In other cases, we might want a hotter fire that's killing some of these overstory trees, especially in a case like this where we're on the edge of a prairie, where maybe that forest was probably more of a savanna than a dense closed canopy forest historically, right? That's a different habitat type. In other cases, we're going to want to burn the brush that's encroached into a prairie, or Douglas firs are native to this area, right? But when they're growing in a prairie, I think of them as an invasive species. They're trying to convert that grassland into a forest. So we're going to put hot fire in those areas and try to maintain our grasslands as best we can. Okay, and with that, I want to save time for questions, but if like also show you one quick video and just let you know that there's the Redwoods League has a great website here with a bunch of videos talking about Redwoods Rising.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, sure. And so, yeah, whenever you're ready, you can press play on that. And so you might, there's a bunch on here, but I'll just show you one. I might be in one or two, but I'm not in this one, so.
Healthy forests are essential not only for trees, but also for the countless species of wildlife that depend on them. Coast redwood forests support a unique community of plants and animals, many of which rely on mature forest. But over 95% of old-growth redwood forests were lost during the industrial logging era, putting this delicate ecosystem at risk. Here in Redwood National State Parks, we've entered a promising new chapter. By using non-invasive technology, we can study even the most elusive wildlife to better understand where they occur on the landscape.
So we're in the greater Mill Creek watershed. Off a little skid road, we're about to go into the woods here and pull up a ARU. So an ARU is an automated recording unit. So we got the microphone right here with a little windscreen, and then all the batteries, SD card, everything's kept inside. We put them up for about a month at a time, essentially, to monitor particularly owl species like northern spotted owl.
The invasion of barred owls into western forests presents a serious threat to the native spotted owl by outcompeting them for habitat and resources. Through Redwoods Rising, we are actively monitoring the habitat use of both species to inform conservation strategies that help maintain ecological balance. Redwoods Rising is a collaboration between Save the Redwoods League, California State Parks, and the National Park Service. About 2/3 of Redwood National State Parks bears the scars of decades of industrial-scale commercial logging. Through Redwoods Rising, we're working to restore thousands of acres of redwood forest, remove hundreds of miles of failing logging roads, and repair critical streams and waterways. The work is already making a huge difference, and in time, a forest like this will look like this.
Sorry, I lied. I wasn't that good then. Yeah. Again, there's more, but I thought let's take a break and let's hear from you guys. If you guys have any questions for me about what I've said so far? What did I miss? What did I forget? Yeah.
What advantage is there to the forest of the prairies that you want to burn with low intensity fires, especially since there are no hunter gatherers there to work the acorn
So the advantage to the forest or to the prairie?
To the forest.
To the forest
What's the benefit of the diversity?
of the diversity. And well, let me answer that a few ways, I guess. The advantage of burning in the forest, for one, is to reduce fuel loads enough so that if a wildfire comes, there's less stuff to burn. And therefore the fire is less hot and less likely to kill all the overstory trees or to be uncontrollable, so it jumps onto private land and makes problems.
Fire.
Yeah, they're kind of making a fire break of sorts, but it also increases the diversity. Like, this is one thing I think people don't understand very well about a lot of the old growth forests, redwood forests in this area. They're actually incredibly dense with trees compared to what was there historically. So at some point, it would actually be good to have fires in there to kill some of those overstory trees to make a more open forest like was there historically. Then that extra light getting to the forest floor and the lack of shrubs that it's going to kill is going to make profound changes that we don't even completely understand at this point, but will make for a more diverse habitat. And just to give you one small example, we were talking about the northern spotted owl there. So the spotted owl likes old growth forests, right? The way our forests are now, the brush, the shrubs on the ground are so overcrowded that it's really hard for a spotted owl to see enough of the ground to hunt. So it's great for like the northern flying squirrel and the dusky footed wood rat that the spotted owls like to eat. But it's not good for the owl because they need the combination of dense shrubs where the critters that they eat can hide, and then openings where when the critters are in the openings, the owls can eat some of them. So again, creating that diversity of habitat is really an ideal goal for a lot of species.
So that 5% old growth is just in the national, I think of all the forests, there's only 2% left.
Well, there's, and this is a number that's really tough to quantify because even like what is old growth is not a really easy question to answer. But there's a general agreement that within the historic range of redwood forests, about 5% of it is still old growth. But if you get into other forest types, that number could be very different, of course. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to stretch a little bit. I don't know if it's an answerable question, but historically, on an acre of old growth redwood forest of a typical environment, how many trees would there have been and how many are there now?
32 trees per acre. I'm a little bit cheeky, but actually there's a paper that says that, but it's really a very tough question because it varies greatly, right? And it's hard to put a number on it. And so a better answer is in an old growth forest could be anywhere from 15 trees per acre to 150 trees per acre in the overstory. And then in the understory, it depends on when the last fire came through. It could be 0 because there was a fire recently, or a much bigger number because things are recovering.
2 years ago, I drove up to Portland for a talk that was being given there about looking at old historical fire data and fires coming through, and they showed a landscape that was their projection of just natural fire.
Mm-hmm.
And the separation between trees on this horizon view, and then a picture of what they had found with the introduction of fire. And it's not only a separation, I mean, there's different varieties and there's different, and we're not talking a redwood forest here, which tends to be a monoculture of redwoods. But
yeah, so it varies greatly depending on the habitat you're talking about.
It's just the idea of looking at a hilltop and seeing the trees not touching.
Yes.
It's like, ooh, that could be a reality.
Right. It would be a
worked.
very different world, right? Yeah. And it depends again on what part of the redwood belt you're talking about to how different it was 200 years ago or whatever. But yeah, certainly some places closed canopy, in other places very open forest with open grown trees. Yeah.
Question, but how closely do you work with the tribes? And since it's on federal land, do you guys still do environmental impact reports to timber harvest plans, or does it just kind of like, how do you?
So, yeah, so we are working with tribes. We're consulting and partnering with them on many of these projects and pulling them in to be more involved over time as the tribes, you know, I mean, I guess all the tribes are different, but like some tribes have a more developed natural resources branch than others just because of, you know, funding and a myriad of factors. But we're bringing them along and consulting with them and trying to get them to be a bigger part of it all. And so we've got federal and state land within this partnership. So in this case, that's a great question that, you know, will go over a lot of people's heads, but it's perfect because we actually decided to do both federal compliance and state compliance on all the land, which sounds like kind of overkill because like on state land, you only have to do state, and on federal land, you only have to do federal. But we did both on both because sometimes there's grants that say, well, you have to do the federal NEPA stuff, or you have to do the state Sequoia stuff for you to qualify for the grant. So we're like, well, we're just going to do it all. So we qualify for everything.
So like, you're still doing like a geological surveys.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That kind of piggybacked with, there was somebody online that had asked if you were partnering with Yurok tribe.
Yeah. Yeah. We're bringing it and consulting them. In fact, I don't know if you drive by Oregon much, but that whole restoration site there is run by the Yurok tribe, and Redwood National and State Parks are helping out with that. And the state Redwood League are helping out with that as well. Yeah.
So you're talking about restoration specifically with like, most of the vegetation is going to come back naturally. But I was curious, one, are you like, what kind of plants are you planting back that are underrepresented? And then what are some of the plants that just come back naturally as soon as you establish an habitat?
Yeah, so most things come back naturally. So that's the kind of easy answer. But we look for, I guess in the big picture, what generally happens is the timber companies, when you clear cut a piece of land, you know, the standard thing was clear cut, burn it, and then plant it. And planting could mean planting trees or aerial seeding, just dumping seeds out there. But in both cases, it tended to shift the species composition towards Douglas fir away from redwood. So like when we're cutting, we're usually cutting more Douglas fir and fewer redwoods to shift that species composition. But minor species were like not really part of the equation. So occasionally we'll plant like some of the cedars or grand firs to get them kind of a foothold. And Port Orford cedar is a especially important one where I don't know if you know much about the Port Orford cedar root rot, but it's a big problem that's killing a lot of our Port Orford cedars. There is a genetically resistant strain of Port Orford cedars. So we've been planting some of that to get that genetic resistant material out on the landscape to help, you know, that species thrive in this world with the root rot involved. Yeah.
Oh, when will the project sunset? Is there a Redwood Rising 2.0?
So that's a good question. So there was we talk a lot about phase one in all of our environmental documents, and we've been kind of sticking to that pretty well, but we're kind of on phase two for a lot of the project area. So yeah, I don't know when it'll sunset. But it's a long ways off because there's so many acres within the partnership that needs to be restoring. So it's more, I think, a matter of what does that phase two or three or whatever look like. Right now, I showed you those two project areas, but there's nothing really up Redwood Creek where there's a huge amount of second growth. Or, you know, we even kicked around the idea of Humboldt Redwood State Park. All of us on state parks manage that land as well as up here. So we could do that too, but, you know, maybe partnering with the Forest Service or others, you know, it's sky's the limit, I guess. Yeah.
That just under 5% of original old growth. Do you know what that equates to in acreage?
Oh, I should, but I don't have that number off the top of my head. Yeah, no, let me think about it. I can maybe do a ballpark.
Well, those are 2 million acres.
2 million? That sounds right, yeah. And I think there's, let me think, there's, all right, maybe do the math. Let me so within the park, if there's 40,000 acres of old growth, and I think that's about 40% of the old growth. So I think 80, so there's probably about 100,000 acres. That's super rough. If I'm on film, oh God. I could be off base, but that gets us in the ballpark, I think, anyway. Yeah, right. Don't fact check me. Or don't take my word for it. Another way to say it, please. Yeah.
Are you able to get a sense for how resilient these forests are, given that climate is warming, the fog is reducing, the soils, that kind of stuff?
Great question. So, yes, I think they're incredibly resilient, but it is an important consideration as we're doing this restoration, because the nuance there is we look at the historic conditions or try to figure out what historic conditions look like. And that's kind of like the rough blueprint of what we want, right? Like if it was here historically, that's probably what we want. But climate change means maybe what was here before isn't actually what should be here in the future. And the other big thing is fire regimes. Like most historically, old growth redwood forests were burning every 10 to 20 years. And I'm having a hard time imagining a reality in which we're able to burn that much, that frequently. I'd love for that to be, like, we can aspire for that, but I know it's a long way off. Not only for logistics of trying to burn near houses and such, but the amount of smoke that's going to be in the air, people are going to complain. But so when we're managing these forests, we're trying to keep that in mind. So we think about what was here. And again, what was here is, sorry, I digress a little bit, but an old growth forest is not a static thing, right? Old growth forests, they're changing all the time. And so I can't say 32 trees per acre. That's like ridiculous, because not only is there a great diversity at any one time, but every place is changing in its density over time. So again, this is a rough outline of historic conditions, but then think about, well, what fire regime is realistic and what's going to happen with hotter summers, drier summers, and maybe bigger storms, these different things. We really want to build in resiliency. And that's part of why minor species like the Port Orford cedar come in handy, because what do we know? Maybe under the future climate, Port Orford cedars are going to do better than Douglas fir. If that's the case, then fine. We need to have Port Orford cedars out there on the landscape to seed into these areas naturally and to be maintained as a component in that, whatever that future forest looks like.
A couple online. Oh, go ahead. Sure.
Yeah.
Are there any similar programs that are focusing on climate restoration?
Not that I know of. There are some cases like Calaveras Big Trees, which is another state park in the giant Sequoia, where that park and Save the Redwoods League is trying to partner with their neighbors in order to make more succinct burn units for prescribed burning and such. But it's there probably are some out there somewhere, but I don't know of anything anywhere close to the scale of what we're doing. Yeah. And there was another question somewhere. Yeah.
How do you think that's for Redwood Rising or similar restoration?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. Oh, how about public engagement? How can the public help further Redwoods Rising? I think really that's one of the great things of partnering with Redwood National Park. I'm sorry, partnering with Save the Redwoods League is that they're a great mechanism for getting people involved in many different levels. But that being said, also within California state parks and Redwood National Park, there are also a lot of volunteer opportunities, both within Redwoods Rising and within the greater area that those two parks are working on under. So yeah, our invasive species program is probably one of the easier ones to get involved. They're doing ivy eradication and other projects quite frequently. Yeah. So yeah, there's good opportunities out there for sure. Online?
Yeah.
Or
Get a couple online.
Sure.
One is a comment. David says, thank you for the talk, but more so for the work that you're doing. It's really a beacon of hope that Redwoods Rising is facilitating the creation of old growth forests.
Well, thanks for that. I just want to say like how lucky I feel to have a job as awesome as being able to work on this project. So yeah, it's lucky me.
Thank you. And then also Tom wanted to know, how do we make sure that isolated old redwoods are not logged by logging companies? And what's the best way to contact you?
Contact me. I'm not too hard to Google, but my name, Lathrop Leonard, lathrop.leonard@parks.ca.gov is my email. So that's probably the best way. Yeah, there's it is getting harder and harder. Like you can't really log an old growth forest anymore under old growth redwood forest under California law these days. Individual trees, even there, it's a pretty tough battle. Again, it kind of depends a little bit on how you define old growth. So, you know, I'm not saying that there isn't more that could be done in some cases, but they're pretty well protected. I think the main thing is that if you've got an isolated tree, while that can be great habitat, I think the work now is on buffering those and creating better habitat around the individual tree, because an individual tree doesn't account for much. But if it can be like the nesting site for a northern spotted owl around marginal habitat, maybe we've got something to build on there.
Yeah. And also there was another online question about, do you work with native artifacts that might be in these areas that you're cleaning up?
So we, whenever we do any ground disturbing work, and this is state law, which we're happy to abide by, we do surveys beforehand for rare plants, endangered species, and artifacts. And if we find any kind of artifacts, then we rope off a big no disturbance zone and rely on our archaeologist and the State Historic Preservation Office to guide about what we should do and how we should preserve that, which is a little harder, especially in the prescribed firework world, because sometimes it's like, don't burn that. And it's like, oh, dang, okay, well, yeah, burn everything but that piece. But anyway, we find a way to do it, but it's, you know, it's part of the game. It's part of what you've got to figure out. Yeah.
All right, well, we still have some online questions, but it is past 8, so I do want to let folks go. And thank you so much for your time. This was a fantastic talk. Obviously, we had a ton of people here and online that were very excited to hear about what Redwoods Rising has been up to. So we appreciate coming out and sharing all of this amazing work with us. And for people that do want to get involved, there are a lot of state park opportunities, like you mentioned, especially on Saturdays and Sundays, where they're doing a lot of invasive species management, especially, that you could get involved with to help out. So, and here in Sequoia Park, obviously we've got the Sequoia Park Ivy League working behind the zoo, pulling lots of ivy. So